When I first moved into Whispering Pines, I was looking for exactly what the name promised: quiet. After 22 years with the Bureau, most of them buried under deep, undercover assignments, I didn't crave much, just a modest home, a clean porch where I could drink my morning coffee, and a backyard where my dog Scout could chase squirrels to his heart's content. No more wiretaps, no more tailing arms dealers, no more holding a gun under a dinner table while pretending to be someone I wasn't. Just me peace. And a house that felt like I could finally exhale in. The house wasn't grand by any stretch. Single-story faded siding, a garden that needed love, but it had soul. And land. Enough land to feel like I could stretch without hearing the neighbor sneeze. That was rare in these parts, and that made it perfect. I signed the closing papers without a second thought, barely noticing the fine print on the HOA addendum. To me, those things were just bureaucratic wallpaper. Rules about mailbox paint color, or when trash bins could be wheeled to the curb, annoying but harmless. I dealt with far worse red tape in federal operations. What I didn't expect was Karen Mullins. She introduced herself within 24 hours of me moving in. Though introduced might be too generous a word. She marched onto my property with a clipboard-oversized sunglasses perched high on her angular face and a smirk that said she had waited her whole life to interrogate someone exactly like me. "You're Mr. Cooper?" she asked without offering a handshake. "Ben," I said, adjusting the moving box in my arms. She clicked her pen. "We had a committee meeting last week. Your lawn exceeds the height requirement by at least 2 inches. Also, satellite dishes are restricted to rear roof lines. Only yours is on the east corner. That will need to be addressed immediately." I blinked. I just got here yesterday. She smiled like a vulture, circling something warm. "The HOA doesn't make exceptions for move-ins. Standards are what keep our community strong." Then she turned and walked off my property without waiting for a reply. Scout let out a low growl. I couldn't blame him. At first, I did what I always did in civilian life. I nodded, complied where it made sense, and ignored the rest. I trimmed the lawn. I shifted the dish. I even repainted the mailbox just to avoid her paper notes, which she left rolled up and rubber-banded to my doorknob like passive-aggressive grenades. But she kept coming, always finding something new. A shade variation in my fence stain. A prohibited plant species that she said was invasive, though it was a simple aloe in a pot on my porch. By the 3rd week, I'd collected 5 warnings. No fines yet, just threats. And looks from neighbors that felt like a mix of fear and pity. A man across the street, Jeff, once gave me a sympathetic shrug as he dragged his garbage bins down the driveway, but said nothing. I got the feeling most folks had learned it was easier to stay quiet, to submit, to blend in. But I couldn't blend in. Not really. It was in my bones to push back when something smelled wrong. I had spent too many years listening for subtle lies, watching for patterns of control, seeing how power could corrupt in the smallest of ways. And Whispering Pines, it was small power, wielded like a sledgehammer. One night, I came home late from a drive out to the lake. Scout had his head out the window most of the time, the breeze making his ears dance. I just needed space, air, something that didn't feel policed. But when I turned into my driveway, my headlights caught something strange. 2 figures in my backyard, holding flashlights, walking with purpose. I killed the engine, stepped out quietly, and kept a hand near the small holster tucked into my waistband. They were gone by the time I reached the back gate, but they'd left footprints in the soft soil near my tool shed. Fresh ones. I found a cigarette butt too. Menthol, not mine. I reported it the next morning to the HOA office. Their secretary, a tired-looking woman named Belinda, barely looked up as she scribbled down my concern. "You think someone broke into your yard?" "No, I know someone did." "Well, that's not an HOA issue," she said flatly. "Try the sheriff's office." "I think they were from your board." She looked up then just briefly. "I'll make a note." I left without saying another word, but I didn't let it go. That night, I installed a pair of motion sensor cameras tucked just under the eaves. Not the cheap Wi-Fi ones either. Real surveillance gear, silent and precise. Over the next week, I caught them 4 more times, always at night, always in pairs, taking photos, measuring things. Once they even stepped onto my porch and peered through the front window. They didn't know who I was, and that was their first mistake. I'd spent 2 decades learning how to dismantle criminal networks by watching the way power was abused in silence. And Whispering Pines, beneath the beige picket fences, and carefully pruned hedges was starting to look familiar. The first official fine arrived in a thick white envelope stamped with the Whispering Pines HOA insignia. I opened it while sitting on my back steps, Scout curled at my feet, the morning sun just beginning to push away the chill. Inside was a letter formatted like a legal notice, listing a total of $275. In violations, unapproved lawn growth, unauthorized storage unit in side yard, and my personal favorite, failure to respond to previous compliance notices. The letter was signed by Karen Mullins, president. No photos, no timestamps, no explanation of who inspected what or when. Just fees, dead serious ones, and a due date set precisely 7 days out. I stood there with the letter in my hand, watching my so-called unapproved lawn sway gently in the breeze, uniform and trimmed. The storage unit was a small aluminum shed I'd inherited, with the property fully permitted, original to the build. I knew that because I had checked the parcel history before I ever bought the place. I might have been seeking peace, but I hadn't turned off my instincts completely. I didn't pay the fine. Instead, I wrote a formal response, addressed it to the HOA's main office, and included detailed photos of the lawn, the shed, and a copy of the original permit. I hand-delivered it the next day and made sure Belinda stamped the receipt. I kept a copy for myself, too. One thing I'd learned in the field paper trails are everything. I thought that would settle it. It didn't. Karen responded by doubling the fine and attaching an additional charge of $50 for noncompliance with corrective protocol. At this point, I knew exactly what I was dealing with. It wasn't about the lawn, or the shed, or any alleged violation. It was about power, about someone who had convinced herself that controlling other people made her important. It was textbook, the kind of behavior I used to track in corrupt local officials and low-level syndicate leaders who ran their blocks like empires. The HOA, I realized, was just her kingdom. What struck me most was how scared everyone seemed to be of her. One morning, I saw my neighbor Jeff standing at the edge of his lawn, frozen, staring at the strip of grass between his driveway and mine. His mower had accidentally left a faint trail across the invisible line that divided our properties. I walked over, beer in hand, and offered it to him. He shook his head. "Appreciate it, Ben, but I gotta respray that before Karen drives by." "You serious?" He gave me a look. She fined the Johnsons $100 last fall for planting the wrong color mums. Said they disrupted the neighborhood's visual integrity. They moved 2 months later. It wasn't long after that when my mailbox was vandalized. The front had been spray painted with a single word, outsider. It wasn't random. The paint was HOA red, yes, that's a thing, and the handwriting was neat, almost practiced. Whoever had done it wanted to send a message, not just cause chaos. I filed a police report with the county. The deputy was polite but indifferent. "Technically, it's private property," he told me, "and Whispering Pines falls under the HOA's governance. If they say it's a civil issue, there's not much we can do." I stared at him for a moment. "Are you telling me the HOA has more authority than the sheriff's department?" He shifted uncomfortably. "I'm saying they have their own rules. You signed when you moved in." I wanted to laugh or scream. Instead, I nodded and left. I had worked long enough in federal cases to understand how local enforcement often gave deference to HOAs, viewing them as self-contained ecosystems. But this wasn't some dispute over trash cans or party noise. This was targeted harassment. It was strategic, it was personal, and it was escalating. 2 days later, I received a certified letter informing me that the total accumulated fees now exceeded $900 and that additional punitive action would be discussed at the next board meeting if I failed to settle the balance. I showed up to that meeting. They held it in the community clubhouse, a sterile building that smelled like lemon cleaner and tension. Karen sat at the head of the folding table, flanked by 4 board members who looked more like her disciples than decision-makers. One of them, a man named Howard, kept adjusting his tie like he was on trial. Another, Denise, looked everywhere but at me. When it was my turn to speak, I stood calmly and slid a manila folder across the table toward Karen. She didn't touch it. "It's documentation," I said. "Photos, permits, proof of payment history. I haven't violated anything. This fine is retaliatory." She smiled tightly. "The board has reviewed the situation and found your arguments unconvincing. The fines will remain. If unpaid, they will result in a lien and potential further enforcement." "Further enforcement?" I asked. Karen leaned forward. We have full authority to act in accordance with the bylaws. If a resident repeatedly refuses to comply, the HOA can take steps to protect the neighborhood's integrity, including structural actions. I paused. Are you threatening to seize or alter my property over unproven fees? Howard looked panicked. We're not threatening per se. Karen cut him off. This meeting is adjourned. I stood there still as everyone filed out. I didn't shout. I didn't argue, but I took note every name, every face, every word. They didn't know what I could do, and I wasn't ready yet to show them. That night, I opened the secure briefcase I hadn't touched in over a year. Inside was my badge tucked beside credentials that could open doors from DC to Denver. I stared at it for a long time, feeling the weight of who I had been. I didn't want to go back to that world, but maybe that world was exactly what this place needed. The last straw came a week later. A second demolition notice, this time nailed to my front door, signed again by Karen, and dated for exactly 10 days from now. By the time I received the second demolition notice, something inside me shifted. Not the usual tension, not anger or disbelief, but that familiar coil in my chest I hadn't felt since my days on assignment in South Texas, when every movement, every word, every piece of paper might be a lie. That kind of alertness never really leaves you. It just sleeps. And that notice, it woke it. The document was thicker this time, stapled at the corners, printed on faux legal paper, with stamped seals that looked just authentic enough to fool the average resident. But I wasn't average. I spent years dismantling syndicates who used shell documents and fraudulent filings to steal homes, pensions, even entire identities. Karen's game was amateur by comparison, but more dangerous in one critical way. No one here questioned her. I spent that evening reviewing the HOA bylaws I had ignored during escrow. 89 pages of vague legalese tacked onto the closing documents like a casual afterthought. That was my mistake. I'd dealt with arms traffickers and cartel lawyers, but I hadn't read the rules governing my own neighborhood. I didn't expect the enemy to wear beige, and they were an enemy now, that much was clear. The bylaws contained no language about demolition authority, not without a county court order. No provisions for structural enforcement based on unpaid dues, unless they escalated to foreclosure status, and even then, it required a judgment. What Karen had signed and posted was not just a bluff. It was fraud. It was actionable. And it was criminal. I kept digging. Over the next few days, I stopped shaving. I stopped walking Scout down the street. I became a ghost inside my own home, not because I was afraid, but because I needed to watch. And I started seeing it. Karen's black SUV drove past my house 14 times in 3 days. Sometimes she didn't even slow down. Sometimes she paused long enough to glare at my windows long enough to make sure I saw her. Once I caught her taking photos from the driver's seat. I took a few of my own in return. On the 5th morning, I stepped outside to find a large orange construction stake hammered into my front yard near the walkway, crooked but deliberate. No note, no explanation. I pulled it out, tossed it on my porch, and installed a second camera, this one hidden in the birdhouse above the mailbox. That night, I caught her again. Not just Karen this time, but Denise and a third man I hadn't seen before. They were measuring something, plotting, laughing. I sent copies of the footage to 3 different cloud accounts. The good kind encrypted, inaccessible, without layered authentication. Then I sent a single frame of the video to Karen's HOA email. No subject line. Just the image her holding a tape measure in my yard. No reply. But the next morning, my water was shut off. I called the utility department. Sorry, Mr. Cooper, but according to our records, the HOA submitted a maintenance override request, emergency valve check. And who approved that, I asked. Silence. Then a soft, someone from the HOA board has override clearance. It happens sometimes. I drove down to the city office, showed them my ID, not my badge, just the standard state-issued one. I explained the situation quietly, diplomatically. I've learned that anger makes people retreat, but calm confidence can make them start digging. A young woman named Alicia took me into the back records room. Turns out the override request was forged. The signature on the form didn't match the registered HOA authority. Worse, the address field on the form had been altered after printing whiteout visible under the signature box. Sloppy work. I photographed everything. No badge needed, just slow hands and a phone I kept on silent. When I returned home, I found a group of 3 HOA compliance volunteers parked on the curb out front. They stood in a triangle, arms crossed, wearing the HOA vests, like they were deputies on a manhunt. "You're trespassing," I said evenly. One of them, a man in his 50s with a beer belly and a walkie-talkie clipped to his belt, smirked. "We're here on inspection business. HOA bylaws permit visual checks for ongoing enforcement actions." I stepped closer. "You're standing on my grass. That's private property. You've got 10 seconds to leave." Karen's voice cut in from the SUV behind them. "Don't engage with him, gentlemen. He's unstable. We filed incident reports." The word unstable hit me harder than I expected. I'd been called many things in my career: unpredictable, obsessive, even reckless, but never unstable. That word was a weapon. A legal wedge. In this context, it meant something more. They were building a narrative, not just a fine. They were preparing to justify whatever came next. I took a slow breath. Scout barked once from inside. Karen leaned out her window. "You're not above the rules, Mr. Cooper. You may think you're special, but this neighborhood has a way of humbling people." I didn't answer. I just walked away. Not because I was scared, because I was about to flip the entire board over and they had no idea what hand I was holding. That night, I reactivated a secure channel through the Bureau's off-duty agent system. I still had clearances limited, but active. I ran a background check on Karen Mullins. Her resume looked clean to clean. No criminal record. Former real estate broker. Declared bankruptcy in 2014, but had since rebuilt her image through community service and local leadership. But beneath the surface, things got interesting. A former colleague of hers had filed a civil suit years ago alleging fraudulent commissions and misappropriation of escrow funds. The case had been settled quietly. The records were sealed, but the docket code marked it as prejudicial closure, which only happens when something shady was buried. I wrote down the name of the judge. I opened a second tab and searched the HOA's recent financial records, those required by law to be posted annually. There were gaps, massive ones. Disbursements to shell vendors, oversized administrative expenses, and vague contractor fees with no listed EIN numbers. Someone was embezzling, not sloppily, but comfortably, like they'd done it for years. I leaned back, stared at the screen, and whispered, "You picked the wrong guy, Karen." The next morning, I received an email from a whistleblower using a burner Gmail account. Just one sentence. "If they demolish your house, they'll do it to mine next." Attached was a PDF. It was the blueprint of my home marked with red X's. Demolition was scheduled for Monday at 9 a.m. Monday came like a gunshot at the end of a long breath. I barely slept the night before. Scout paced the foot of my bed while I lay fully clothed, eyes wide open, mind tracing every inch of strategy. Every contingency plan I'd filed away from years of fieldwork. I didn't need to guess anymore. I knew today was the day they were coming for my home. The HOA hadn't filed a court order. They hadn't issued a lien through any verified county process. There were no hearings, no arbitrations, no right to appeal, just a crude demolition notice signed by Karen Mullins and taped to my front door like it carried the weight of law. But in truth, it was worth less than the tape holding it up. And yet, they were doing it anyway. At 8:52 a.m., I heard the unmistakable sound of diesel engines. Not one. Two. A pair of flatbed trucks rolled slowly onto my cul-de-sac, hauling a bulldozer and a backhoe. Both were painted with generic logos, Silver Rock Contracting. No DOT number, no website. Just another shell company, probably paid under the table from the HOA's emergency repair fund. I stepped out onto my porch, with Scout beside me, leashed but bristling. My boots hit the wood with calm weight. I was dressed in jeans and a gray FBI training hoodie, the one they gave us after Quantico. Not flashy, not official, but enough to signal to anyone paying attention that I wasn't just a regular guy. Karen's SUV pulled up right behind the truck's hazard lights, blinking like they made her more legitimate. She stepped out with a folder under one arm and 4 men following her, all in matching beige vests with laminated HOA IDs swinging from their necks. One carried a megaphone. Another held what looked like a clipboard wrapped in clear plastic already damp from the morning mist. Karen adjusted her sunglasses and approached my lawn like she was leading a battalion. "Mr. Cooper," she called loud and theatrical. You have been notified multiple times of your continued refusal to comply with the terms of our agreement. The HOA has elected to enforce structural removal in accordance with Chapter 7 of our bylaws. I didn't move, I just stared. She waved to the man with the megaphone. Begin. The bulldozer engine roared to life. Scout snarled low beside me. I tightened my grip on the leash. And then I took one step forward. Stop, I said, calm as a judge's gavel. Karen sneered. You don't have the authority to interfere. No, I said, reaching into the chest pocket of my hoodie. But this does. I pulled out the badge. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Gleaming gold, unmistakable, and backed by a laminated ID with my full name, credentials, and expiration date. The effect was instant. The contractors stopped moving. The men in vests froze like statues. One of them visibly paled. The megaphone guy lowered the plastic clipboard like it had suddenly become radioactive. Karen for the first time looked uncertain. Then she doubled down. That's not real, she said, voice cracking. You're bluffing. I flipped the badge toward the closest body cam on one of the HOA volunteers, making sure every inch of it was captured. Then I turned to the contractors. This is an unlawful demolition. If any of you so much as touch your equipment, you'll be committing federal property destruction on an active agent's residence. The man on the backhoe raised both hands. Karen snapped. He's not even active. He's lying. You don't have jurisdiction. I turned to face her directly, the weight of every case file, every takedown, every deep cover operation settling into my stance. I'm not lying, Karen, and what I do have is probable cause. That was when I saw it, the flicker in her eye. A calculation. She was trying to read me, figure out how much I knew how much I was bluffing if this was just a scare tactic. What she didn't know was that I already had a sealed envelope in the Bureau's system timestamped and sent the night before detailing every suspicious financial activity I'd tracked through the HOA. The red flag contracts, the forged override forms, the night vision footage of her trespassing, and most damning of all, the PDF with the red X's. I took out my phone and tapped a few times, projecting it onto the Bluetooth speaker I'd set up on the porch rail that morning. A robotic voice played aloud, scheduled demolition property, 1145 Pineview Lane. Authorized by HOA President Karen Mullins. Contractor, Silver Rock. Payment $12,000. No invoice number. Karen lunged forward. You can't, that's private information. It was emailed to me by someone on your board, I said coolly. You're losing control, Karen, and trust me, this is the nicest way it's going to go. She turned barking orders at the contractors to start moving again. That's when the sheriff's cruiser pulled up behind her. And another. And another. 3 in total. Deputy Simmons stepped out first. I knew him from the utility office, the one who hadn't wanted to get involved. But his face looked different now. Serious. Apologetic. We got a call from City Code Enforcement, he said, walking up. Seems someone submitted a forged demolition order. County records had no knowledge of it. State too. He looked at Karen. Ma'am, do you have any legal permits authorizing this demolition? Karen was trembling now. I am the HOA president. This man has been in violation for months. This property. Simmons held up a hand. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to stop talking unless you're ready to provide proof of authorization. And for the record, impersonating municipal authority is a felony in this state. Karen opened her mouth to reply, then stopped. The contractors began backing their trucks out. I watched her carefully, almost hoping she'd run. But she didn't. She stood there, heels rooted in the muddy grass, fury and humiliation written all over her face. As the sheriff spoke quietly with 2 of the other deputies, I walked over to the lead contractor. Did she pay you in cash? He nodded slowly. Keep the receipt, I said. You'll need it. Karen screamed then. Not a word. Just a shrill guttural sound of rage and fear combined. Scout barked once in reply, then sat calmly by my side. I looked down at him, then back at her. Like I said, I told her, voice low but clear, you picked the wrong house. I wish I could tell you that Karen's little coup died that day. That the retreat of the bulldozers, the flash of the badge, and the arrival of law enforcement ended it all. I really do. But power doesn't relinquish itself quietly. It flails. It twists. It tries to survive by any means necessary. And Karen wasn't just clinging to control, she was drowning in it. 2 days after the demolition standoff, a notice was hand-delivered to me by a private process server not even local. A civil suit filed by the HOA against me alleging defamation, harassment, and obstruction of community standards. The amount they were asking for, $120,000 in damages. I laughed when I read it. But it wasn't a funny laugh. It was the kind of laugh you let out when the absurdity of something gets so dark it wraps around and tries to call itself normal. Karen was coming after me with every legal thread she could pull. Not to win, just to tie me down. To punish me for challenging her. But she didn't know what she'd triggered. See, a civil suit opens discovery. And discovery, that's where the truth lives. I filed a formal countersuit within 24 hours, alleging abuse of process, civil rights violations, trespass, and attempted property theft. I attached a detailed timeline video, surveillance logs, screenshots of emails, forged documents, and recorded audio from 2 of her HOA meetings where she had flat out lied to the board about my dangerous behavior. But the suit wasn't my only focus. Behind the scenes, I was building something larger, something with teeth. Through the Bureau's off-duty liaison portal, I reached out to an internal affairs contact I'd known for years. A quiet man named Lewis. The kind of agent who didn't blink, didn't flinch, and never rushed. I gave him the folder. Everything. The shell companies. The embezzlement patterns. The fake bids from construction contractors tied back to Karen's nephew's LLC in Nevada. The money trail was sloppy, but bold. And it got worse. One night, while double-checking financial records from the HOA's fiscal disclosures, I noticed something off. There was a vendor listed, Marson Environmental Solutions, receiving monthly payments for soil analysis and neighborhood landscaping reports. Problem, the company didn't exist. No business license, no address, just a disconnected phone number. It was a ghost company. And according to HOA records, it had received $58,400 in a single year. I traced the bank routing number on the payment receipts through encrypted databases. It tied directly to a personal account under Karen's maiden name. Classic laundering tactic, simple, small-scale, but effective enough to fool sleepy audits. That was when I knew this wasn't just about me. Karen had been bleeding the community dry for years. Every flower bed grant, every emergency roof repair, every HOA barbecue invoice overinflated and falsified. She'd weaponized bureaucracy and buried it under the assumption that no one would ever fight back. But I wasn't just anyone. Still, that didn't mean I was untouchable. 3 nights later, while Scout and I were asleep, someone threw a brick through my front window. It came in low and fast, shattering the glass in a burst of cold wind and red dust. Scout went wild, howling, snarling, pawing at the glass shards. I hit the ground and rolled to the side, instincts firing, heart racing. No note, no spray paint, just the brick. I reviewed the footage from my exterior cameras. Grainy figures. 2 of them, hooded. They stayed just outside the floodlight range. No car plate, no clear faces. But the timing, right after I filed an ethics complaint with the County Board of Housing and Neighborhood Affairs. Coincidence? I didn't believe in those. I forwarded the footage to the local PD. The officer took the report, but his tone was tired, resigned. I could see it in his eyes. He knew this wasn't random. He also knew Karen had connections. She served on the Citizen Liaison Committee for the County Sheriff's Department. Another buffer. Another layer. But even connections have cracks. Because while Karen was busy throwing lawsuits and bricks, I had quietly sent an anonymous package to the IRS Regional Fraud Unit, complete with evidence of unreported income, altered tax forms, and HOA income misappropriation. I didn't just want her stopped. I wanted her accountable. Then everything unraveled at once. It started on a Tuesday. I was sitting on the porch with Scout nursing a strong cup of black coffee when a black SUV pulled up. Not Karen's. This one was clean federal plates, tinted windows. 2 men stepped out. I knew the look before they even said a word. Clean suits, stern faces. One carried a silver briefcase. Mr. Cooper. I stood. Yeah. We'd like to speak with you about the HOA at Whispering Pines. We went inside. Scout stayed close but calm, sensing something official. They introduced themselves as agents with the Department of Housing and Urban Development's Office of Inspector General. Apparently, I wasn't the only one filing complaints. At least 3 other homeowners had sent anonymous tips. One of them mentioned they were too scared to come forward alone, but had seen my demolition footage. The agents had been quietly investigating multiple HOAs for fraudulent practices across the state. Whispering Pines was now officially on the radar. I handed over everything. USBs, notes, screenshots, recordings. Even the whistleblower email that started it all. They were impressed. One of them looked at me and said, "You should have been an agent." I smiled, retired. They exchanged glances. We'll be in touch. Later that week, an envelope appeared on my porch, no return address, just a folded piece of paper inside. It said, "They're coming for you, be ready." That night, I slept with the lights on. 2 mornings later, I was walking Scout through the wooded trail behind my property when I heard it distant, heavy machinery. I jogged back, heart pounding. I rounded the corner just in time to see it. A massive yellow bulldozer crawling up my driveway like a predator. No warnings, no letters, no sheriff's car. Just Karen standing in her SUV with a phone in her hand, yelling to someone behind the wheel. This time, they weren't bluffing. They were going to demolish my house. And there was nothing I could do to stop it. The blade dropped, wood splintered, glass cracked. I stood at the edge of my lawn and watched the home I built, my escape, my refuge, my quiet place, reduced to rubble. Scout whimpered. I didn't. Because in that moment, I knew something Karen didn't. I was done playing defense. The morning after my house was destroyed, I stood ankle-deep in splinters and ash, the air thick with the scent of exposed insulation and wet soil. Scout was pacing circles around where the kitchen used to be. My hand hovered near his collar, not to restrain him, but to anchor myself. It wasn't just a house they took from me, it was trust. And I'd had enough. I didn't sleep. I didn't call the police. I didn't bother with Karen or her wrecking crew. I let her think she'd won. Let her believe I was broken. That's what people like her counted on: silence, compliance. They think if they crush you hard enough, you'll disappear. I didn't disappear. That afternoon, I opened a secure line and contacted Special Agent Lewis again. My message was brief: it's time. We arranged the meeting at a neutral location, an empty lot near the community's old tennis courts. It was city property, just outside HOA jurisdiction, and more importantly, public land. I wasn't going to confront them on their turf. Not anymore. I sent out emails, 10 of them. Each went to a different homeowner in the neighborhood. Each included a date, time, and a sentence, "Come if you've ever felt silenced." I didn't expect many to show, but when I arrived at the lot just after 4 p.m., there were over 24 people standing in a loose circle, arms folded, eyes shifting. Some I recognized: Jeff, Mrs. Larkin from down the block, even Belinda from the HOA front desk. Most had never spoken to me before. Then Karen arrived. She strutted into the center of the group like she was the host of a block party, wearing her signature red blouse and oversized sunglasses, clipboard in hand. "What is this?" she asked, laughing, but her voice shook just enough to give her away. "A pity party. You know, this kind of assembly violates the neighborhood code for unsanctioned gatherings." I stepped forward. "You're not going to silence these people anymore, Karen." She turned to me slowly, as if still not registering the shift. "You lost your house because you couldn't follow simple rules. That's not my fault. It's yours." I looked around at the crowd, then back to her. "Tell me, Karen, was it my fault when you forged the demolition order? Or when you funneled HOA funds into a shell company registered under your maiden name? Or maybe it was my fault when you bribed contractors to skip inspections and pocketed the difference?" Her face drained of color. "You're delusional," she snapped. "No," I said, my voice level. "I'm federal." That's when I pulled the badge. Not just the wallet, the whole leather case. FBI, clear, unmistakable. The crowd gasped audibly. Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Even Jeff took a step back. I held the badge high, turning in a slow circle, so everyone could see it. "My name is Benjamin Cooper, Special Agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And I've been building a case on this HOA for the past 62 days. Karen stumbled back a step. "No, you're retired." "Not officially," I cut in. "And even if I were, I've got every file, every audio log, every intercepted communication you've made while thinking no one was watching. The forged utility requests, the falsified community votes, the embezzlement, the extortion, the destruction of property. You didn't just mess with the wrong house, Karen. You messed with the United States government." The second I finished speaking, 3 black SUVs pulled up at the edge of the lot. Doors opened. 4 federal agents stepped out along with a city code enforcement officer, 2 IRS auditors, and a sheriff's department captain, all in uniform, all official. Karen whirled around. "This is a setup," she screamed. "You can't do this. You have no authority here. This is HOA jurisdiction." The sheriff stepped forward. Karen Mullins, you are under arrest for filing fraudulent documents, malicious destruction of private property, conspiracy to commit financial crimes, and obstruction of justice. She tried to run. She actually ran. Straight toward the back of the lot, heels sinking in the grass, clipboard flying behind her like a plastic flag of defeat. She didn't get far. 2 federal agents closed the distance in seconds and brought her down gently, but firmly. She was cuffed, read her rights, and walked back across the field in full view of everyone she had lorded over for years. Some cheered. Others just stood silent, stunned that the storm had finally broken. The remaining board members, Howard, Denise, and 2 others, were questioned on the spot. One of them broke down crying. Another lawyered up immediately. Denise. She just looked relieved. I think she'd been waiting for someone to take it all down. When the agents finished processing the scene, the sheriff handed me a statement form. You probably know this, Agent Cooper, he said with a slight smile. But this is the part where we thank you for your service. I nodded, signing the form. He leaned in. You're not staying, are you? I looked back at the empty space where my home once stood. The dirt was raw and uneven. Scout had already curled up near a patch of shade like nothing had ever happened. No, I said, but I'm not leaving either. Later that night, I returned to the lot. It was quiet, still. Karen was gone. The HOA board had been disbanded pending investigation. City officials had temporarily frozen all HOA activity and placed an administrative receiver in charge. But the damage was done, and it was time to rebuild not just my house, but this neighborhood's sense of trust. The next day, I filed paperwork with the City Council to establish an HOA Oversight Committee, a civilian review board that would monitor and audit all HOA activity moving forward. I wasn't just going to tear down corruption. I was going to make sure it never rose again. In the weeks that followed Karen's arrest, Whispering Pines transformed from a controlled, color-coded nightmare into a neighborhood holding its collective breath. Gone were the clipboard patrols, the anonymous fines, the long stares from manicured driveways. For the first time in years, people were speaking openly. Neighbors who once only exchanged nods began gathering on porches, sidewalks, and under the glow of string lights in backyards they once feared might violate some obscure lighting rule. But beneath that air of relief was a deeper current, a need for answers. Because while Karen was in custody, the mess she left behind was still very much alive. The city's administrative receiver, a woman named Julia Tran, appointed by the Department of Consumer Affairs, called me within days of her first audit. She had the tone of someone who had spent years cleaning up disasters. Mr. Cooper, she said over the phone, you weren't exaggerating. She invited me to review her preliminary findings. We met at the temporary HOA office, now located in one of the townhomes Karen had once tried to seize through a fraudulent foreclosure. It was empty, sterile quiet, save for the sound of paper being unboxed and computers being booted up by city interns. Julia handed me a folder labeled Phase 1 Initial Violations. Inside were over 40 pages of financial summaries, contractor ledgers, and HOA fee transactions, highlighted, annotated, color-coded like a war map. She skimmed from every possible line item, Julia said, flipping through the pages with the weariness of someone who'd seen this too often. Community maintenance, landscaping, legal retainers, even the neighborhood newsletter. Everything inflated. Most vendor payments funneled through shell companies tied back to family members or consulting groups that don't exist. She pointed to one name, Gem Property Services. That's her son's LLC. Registered 3 months after she was voted in as HOA president. They received $14,000 in emergency pavement work, no proof of labor. No invoices, no photos, just the disbursement. I took a breath, steadying myself. It wasn't just corruption. It was systemic betrayal. And it's not just... Karen, Julia added. Howard, the board treasurer, was listed as a reviewing officer on nearly half these payouts. And Denise. She signed off on at least 6 of the largest transfers. I clenched my jaw. I'd once believed Denise had been a victim of Karen's intimidation. But now, the paper trail told a different story. She hadn't just enabled this, she'd profited. Julia continued, we're now working with the Department of Justice and the State Auditor's Office. It's likely this will move from civil to full-blown criminal prosecution for the entire board. I nodded slowly, a flood of long-suppressed adrenaline rising in me again. I wasn't an agent on paper anymore, but this investigation, it was personal. It was mine. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. Subpoenas were issued. Accounts were frozen. Depositions were scheduled with former board members and contractors, many of whom turned cooperative once they realized the feds weren't bluffing. Karen's son, he flipped almost immediately. Claimed his mother had forged his name on at least 2 contracts. Claimed he never even saw the money, though the evidence said otherwise. Either way, his testimony opened more doors, particularly into the GEM Property Services Network, which turned out to be a front for 3 more fake entities. I was brought in for formal interviews, first with the local DOJ rep, then with an IRS agent named Wheeler, who had the dry wit of a man used to chasing white-collar crime across 5 states. "Mr. Cooper," he said, "during our second meeting, if you ever get bored of retirement, we've got a desk for you in D.C. I smirked. I prefer my desk to have a view. Outside the formal investigation, I became an unofficial liaison between the city and the residents of Whispering Pines. People began reaching out timidly at first, then with growing confidence. One man, Miguel, told me Karen had tried to fine his family for putting up a birthday banner for their daughter. When he pushed back, she accused him of housing code violations and threatened to report him to immigration authorities, despite the fact that Miguel had been born in Colorado. A widow named Helen shared that Karen had removed her access to community amenities after she refused to vote in favor of a budget increase. "She said my dues were under review," Helen whispered. "I didn't know what that meant, but my pool key stopped working the next day." Another family admitted they had paid over $2,000 in made-up beautification penalties just to avoid a lien on their house. "We didn't want to lose our home," the wife told me, eyes wet. "We thought maybe it was real. We were scared." It was endless. The depth of Karen's reach wasn't just in the money, it was in the fear. She had weaponized the rules-twisted policy into a tool of personal power and targeted the vulnerable. Veterans, immigrants, the elderly. Anyone who might not know how to fight back. So I taught them. I began hosting weekly meetings informal at first, under the pavilion at the edge of the community park. I showed people how to request financial records, how to read city zoning codes, how to file formal complaints that couldn't be ignored. I handed out templates, explained the Fair Housing Act, and taught them about the protections they never knew they had. I wasn't just rebuilding my home. I was helping rebuild a neighborhood that had forgotten what community meant. And then came the call I hadn't expected. "Julia." Then she said, her voice lighter than I'd heard it before. "We got the grand jury indictment." I sat down on the edge of the rebuilt front porch, the frame of my new house rising steadily around me. "All of them." She paused, then said it plainly. "All of them." Karen Howard Denise and 2 auxiliary board members who had signed off on various false resolutions. Multiple felony charges, wire fraud, mail fraud, embezzlement, criminal conspiracy. They were looking at serious time. But that wasn't the best part. Julia cleared her throat. Also, the mayor's office reached out. They're forming a task force citywide HOA oversight committee. They want you on it. Not just as a consultant, as chair. I closed my eyes, letting the weight of the moment settle in. I had come here to disappear. Instead, I had become something else, a symbol of resistance in a war most people didn't even know they were allowed to fight. And I wasn't done yet. Karen's takedown had been dramatic, sure. But it was only the surface rupture. Beneath the collapse of her authority was a network of secrets that unraveled like rotten fabric the deeper we pulled. The more investigators uncovered, the more the HOA began to look less like a neighborhood committee and more like a tightly wound criminal operation with Karen as its nucleus. What shocked even me was how far back it went. According to files Julia's team unearthed from locked cabinets in the clubhouse basement, documents hidden behind paneling and mislabeled boxes, Karen had been manipulating HOA records for nearly 6 years. She hadn't even been president for all of that. She began her rise as landscape committee chair, and even then she had found ways to siphon power. It started small duplicate quotes from fake vendors, reimbursements for supplies that never arrived, overstated work orders. At first, they were mistakes explained away with charm and a firm grasp of the rules. But as her influence grew, so did her appetite and her methods. The HUD and DOJ agents discovered that she had created a network of fake contractors that billed the HOA for everything from tree trimming to pest control. In some cases, the invoices were digitally altered versions of real company receipts, but the routing numbers were changed to accounts under Karen's control. She even had 2 separate email aliases, one of which she used to approve transactions while posing as a third-party financial auditor. It was genius in a twisted way. The board trusted the auditor because they'd never met her, assuming she was independent. In reality, they'd been corresponding with Karen the entire time. And then came the property theft cases. I knew about mine, but I wasn't alone. Karen had systematically targeted residents who pushed back, often those with limited means or legal knowledge. Once fees stacked high enough, usually from fabricated violations, she'd begin the lien process. She had friends at a local title company, people who'd expedite paperwork and quietly file foreclosure notices under the radar. One elderly woman named Ms. Porter had lived in her home for 32 years. After her husband passed, Karen began citing her for degrading exterior paint, gutter rust, and porch clutter. Fines escalated. Notices were sent. She never understood what they meant until a moving crew showed up with a writ of possession and told her she had 48 hours to vacate. She died in a care facility 2 months later. Her home, purchased by a real estate LLC, registered to Karen's cousin in Arizona. That story broke something in me. Not just as an investigator, but as a man, a citizen, a neighbor. I had come to Whispering Pines to heal from a career of chasing darkness across the country. I never imagined I'd find something worse, just 2 doors down. And still we weren't done. Another document surfaced, a secret amendment vote dated 3 years earlier. It was a motion to expand the HOA's authority to include expedited enforcement options in cases of repeated noncompliance. It had been signed by 71 homeowners, except there were only 54 homes in the entire subdivision. Karen had forged 17 votes. We found the originals in a storage unit she had rented under a different name. Pages of forged signatures, many stolen from vendor sign-in sheets or old maintenance logs. Her level of control had been surgical, terrifying, and deeply personal. And yet, when she was arrested, she hadn't said a word. Not in the squad car, not during her arraignment, not even when the charges piled on. Until one day she did. I was called in to observe a voluntary interview she agreed to give federal agents after weeks of silence. I sat behind the two-way mirror watching her through the glass like I used to watch suspects I'd spent years hunting. Karen looked diminished. Her hair had lost its luster. Her clothes hung awkwardly, as if she'd lost weight. Her voice was quiet but not frail, more like someone who had burned through every ounce of rage and was now running only on fumes. When asked why she did it, why the fraud, the manipulation, the demolitions, she gave an answer I'll never forget. Because no one ever told me I couldn't. She said it without pride, without apology, just matter of fact. And in that moment, I realized something chilling. Karen didn't think she was evil. She thought she was right. That she was saving the neighborhood from itself. That her control was necessary, her rules were order, her enforcement was protection. It wasn't about money. It was about power. That was her addiction. And when it became her identity, she no longer saw people as neighbors, but as variables to be managed. After the interview, I stood in the hallway alone for a long time. I wasn't sure what I felt: pity, satisfaction, grief, maybe all of it. What I did know was this justice had begun. And it would take time, yes, but it was real. The grand jury had issued indictments for 5 individuals. 3 had already agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences. One fled the state, caught a week later trying to withdraw cash under a fake name in Reno. And Karen, she was denied bail after investigators proved she had attempted to wire money out of state through a proxy account. Meanwhile, the neighborhood began to rebuild. A new board was formed, temporary, diverse, with actual transparency. Julia and I sat in on their first meeting, not as enforcers, but as advisors. People spoke, people listened, some cried. Some admitted they had gone along with things they didn't understand because it was easier than questioning authority. One woman stood up and said, "I thought Karen was keeping us safe. I thought she knew better. But I forgot that we're supposed to be a community, not a kingdom." There was applause after that, not loud, but real. I stayed late that night helping sort through leftover paperwork, clearing out boxes of old forms, many of which were worthless now. Scout curled up under my chair tail, thumping softly against the floor. One of the new board members, a young man named Victor, approached me. "Why'd you stay?" he asked. "After what happened to your house?" I smiled. "Because if I didn't, she'd still be in charge." He nodded. "You planning to leave now?" I looked at the space outside the window where the framework of my new home was starting to rise. "No," I said. "Now I'm finally home." The morning the arrests were made, it was quiet, eerily so. No wind, no barking dogs, no engines rumbling in the cul-de-sac like usual. Just the kind of silence that happens before something unmovable finally falls. I knew the warrants had been signed overnight. Julia had texted me at 3:11 a.m. with a single word, "green light." The federal agents moved at 7:02 a.m. sharp. By 7:04, Karen Mullins was in handcuffs. She hadn't even had time to put on her shoes. According to the arresting officer, she'd answered the door in a robe, rollers in her hair, still clutching a mug of decaf. They allowed her a moment to change, then escorted her to the waiting SUV parked in her once meticulously landscaped driveway. The irony, the roses she forced others to trim bi-weekly had overgrown. Petals drooped, vines curled past the brick edging. Her own standards had wilted without her control. But it wasn't just Karen. Howard, former treasurer, was arrested at his office. He tried to slam his laptop shut when the agents entered, but they already had a copy of his hard drive. His face, captured by a local news crew, looked more like a man evicted from his illusion than a criminal brought to justice. Denise, despite the mountain of evidence, turned herself in. She arrived at the sheriff's office alone, holding a stack of printed emails. Her lawyer walked one step behind her, but she never looked back. She had known it was coming. The two auxiliary board members, Ruth and Kenny, were arrested at their homes. Both claimed ignorance. But the paper trail showed signatures, approvals, and in Kenny's case, an entire subfolder of falsified invoices he'd created under the label HOA Events. The only event they ever funded was Karen's niece's baby shower, catered by a company owned by her cousin. The press descended within hours. Helicopters hovered. Local outlets aired dramatic headlines: FBI uncovers embezzlement, ring in Whispering Pines, HOA. Neighborhood nightmare, how one woman held a community hostage. Retired agent brings down suburban crime syndicate. That last one made me chuckle. I wasn't a hero. I was a man who got pushed too far. A man who wanted a quiet life and ended up exposing a system people were too scared to question. But if the spotlight helped keep the next Karen from rising to power, I'd accept it. Later that day, I was invited to the interim board's emergency meeting. Julia was there. So was Victor, and most of the residents who'd stood with me during the confrontation at the park. The mood was a strange blend of celebration and caution. Justice had arrived, but the wounds were still raw. "We need to talk about the future," Julia said after the initial announcements. "Not just replacing names on a board, but replacing the culture that let this happen." She turned to me. "Ben?" I stood unsure how to start. I wasn't a public speaker. I didn't give speeches in courtrooms or deliver stirring words from podiums. But I knew what I had lived through, and I knew what needed to be said. I bought my home here because I wanted peace. Because I thought I was done fighting, I began. But what I learned is that silence isn't peace. Control isn't order. And rules without accountability are just another kind of cage. I looked at the faces in the room, some tearful, some angry, most just tired. I'm not here to run things. I'm not here to lead. But I'll be damned if I ever let this place fall back into the hands of fear again. We deserve better, and from now on we'll demand it together. The applause was quiet at first, then louder, then real. That night, I walked scout through the neighborhood. People waved. Kids played without being shushed. One man was repainting his garage door bright yellow. A color Karen would have had a heart attack over. I smiled. The next morning, I received an official letter from the mayor's office. The HOA Oversight Committee had been approved unanimously. I had been confirmed as chair. It wasn't a position of power. It was a position of protection, a civilian shield for residents across the city who had faced what we had faced. And I wasn't alone. Victor would serve as co-chair, Julia as an advisor. Jeff from across the street had volunteered to represent our district. We were no longer just neighbors. We were guardians of what this place was supposed to be. The rebuild of my home began that same week. Not from a contractor Karen had used. From a group of residents who offered to help retired plumbers, electricians, a mason named Derek who showed up with a wheelbarrow and a quiet smile. "We saw what you stood for," he said. "Now let us stand for you." It was slow work. but it was honest. One afternoon, as I hammered in a new porch beam, Jeff handed me a cold soda and looked out over the neighborhood. "Think it'll ever be normal again?" he asked. I considered that. "No," I said, "but it'll be better." Because now the fear was gone. The walls had come down, and in its place something stronger had been built. The first night I slept in my newly rebuilt home, it rained. Not a storm, not violent, just a soft, steady drizzle that tapped gently on the metal roof, soothing like a lullaby. Scout lay curled at the foot of the bed, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of peace. For the first time in months, I didn't fall asleep with tension in my jaw, or the instinct to reach for my firearm in the dark. I slept because I was safe, because I had reclaimed something I never should have had to fight for my dignity. The living room still smelled like fresh lumber. The drywall hadn't been painted yet, and the tile grout was still curing in the kitchen. But the foundation was strong. The frame stood solid, and every nail, every joint, every beam had been placed by someone who had stood with me, not for a paycheck, but for justice. The neighborhood was different now. Whispering Pines had always looked polished, but now it felt alive. I began hosting porch coffee hours every Saturday. No formal agenda, no minutes, just folding chairs, warm mugs, and conversation. Miguel and his wife brought pan dulce one morning. Ms. Larkin made sweet tea that could rival any Southern grandmother's. Jeff eventually stopped apologizing for mowing crooked lines and started talking about installing a hammock. People laughed more, not because things were perfect, but because we were free. The HOA Oversight Committee gained momentum citywide. Complaints from other neighborhoods poured in stories not so different from ours. Arbitrary fines, intimidation, power hoarded and wielded like a weapon. And while not every case mirrored Karen's level of corruption, the trend was unmistakable. Unchecked authority leads to abuse. We organized listening sessions, created templates for accountability, developed a rating system for HOA transparency, and released quarterly audits to the public. Neighborhoods began requesting reviews. Some HOAs restructured proactively. Others resisted until residents inspired by Whispering Pines began pushing back. One night I received a letter from a woman in another part of the state. "Mr. Cooper, we watched what you did. My father was fined $500 for having a cane stuck in the front yard after he slipped on ice. The HOA said it was clutter. He couldn't fight back, but I can now. Thank you. You reminded us we're not helpless." It was handwritten. No return address. I kept it pinned on the fridge next to Scout's flea pill reminder. Then came the invitation I didn't expect. A call from a congressional oversight subcommittee. They'd seen the press coverage, read the DOJ report. They wanted me to testify as a witness for a proposed bill that would federally regulate HOA practices, require third-party audits, and limit enforcement powers to what could be verified and legally justified. I traveled to D.C., stood in a chamber with more marble than warmth, and told my story. Not just about the house, but about Ms. Porter, about Miguel, about fear that had become normalized. I told them how silence doesn't mean compliance, and how thousands of Americans live under invisible regimes run by people with no qualifications beyond ambition and the right friends. I told them about Karen, yes, but I told them about the system that let her exist. The bill didn't pass that year, but it gained traction. And that's how change begins, not in sweeping gestures, but in persistent steps. Back home, the neighborhood kept blooming. Victor and his husband adopted a little girl. She rode her bike up and down the street with streamers on the handles and a horn that made Scout bark every time. Ms. Larkin painted a mural on her garage, a phoenix wings outstretched, rising from orange and gold ash. Jeff hosted the first ever neighborhood chili cook-off on the lot that used to be off-limits for unauthorized gatherings. He lost, graciously. As for me, I rebuilt my porch swing. Same spot, same view. Only this time I hung a small plaque on the post beside it, etched simply, "Never again silent." Sometimes, when I sat there with Scout curled at my feet, I'd look out at the street and remember what it once felt like, how every smile was guarded, every window drawn, every child hushed. How I had arrived wanting only solitude, and instead found a war. But out of that war, we forged a new kind of peace. One that wasn't built on fear but on trust. One that didn't punish difference but welcomed voice. One that didn't retreat into silence, but stood up and spoke. I didn't become a hero. I just refused to disappear. And that made all the difference. So if you're reading this and you're facing something like what we did, if your community has become a cage, if your voice has been buried under threats, if your home is no longer your own, hear this. You are not alone. And no matter how strong they seem, they are never beyond accountability. Stand up. Speak. Fight smartly, legally, relentlessly. Because justice isn't a force that finds us. It's something we build. One nail, one voice, one neighbor at a time.